Mexicans are mostly indigenous people. They're not mostly European. Now it depends on what part. If you're closer to the northern part, you're more European, because even some Germans and others, Irish and others have moved in there, But Mexico is more indigenous in its genome makeup than it is anything else.
Anytime we're trying to sort of understand Mexican-American history and culture, it's very complicated. The U.S.-Mexico War was the first war that the United States invaded another country. President Polk, who was the president at that time, one of his main goals was to get the land, right, that they wanted for westward expansion. He kept very detailed diaries every day of what he did, and in his journals and in his diary is the plan for initiating war with Mexico, since they refused to negotiate and sell that land to them. When Polk sent in the military to that contested terrain, he knew full well that the Mexican army would see that as an attack, would cross over the Rio Grande and initiate, right, a battle with the military.
Thousands of people were lynched and shot and murdered and put in prison.
The U.S. was described as a go-ahead nation, sort of symbolized by like the American Railroad. It was all about moving forward, progress, right, sort of civilization. They didn't see Mexicans as having that capability to sort of build cities and towns right in the West. Mexicans learn about this war because they were occupied. They call it the Second Conquest. That's very telling, right? We don't learn about this war because it mostly happened in another territory. And so when that border is drawn, it divides, right, nations, it divides people. And overnight, people, where this was their territory, now they become foreigners in their native land.
The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised that former residents of Mexico who are now living in the American West would be afforded all and full and complete rights as American citizens. Well, that wasn't always honored.
It promised respect for Mexicans, that their culture, their language, their religion, if they stayed in the United States.
Hey, somebody's shooting.
No.
Why, there too. I heard them.
Sound like it's over to the dam. Let's get going.
Today, you know, in the 21st century, we think about the American cowboys, the quintessential American. But if you go back to the 19th century and you read newspapers of the period, they hated cowboys because for them, a cowboy was a thief on horseback.
The newspapers and the media also are very important in portraying the Mexicans and the Chicanos as bandits and outlaws. So we have that to this day, too, with the media.
We better get out of here.
No, wait.
things really began to change because of the revolution in Mexico. And there were a lot of refugees who fled the violence. In fact, there have been some studies about how violent the Mexican Revolution was, and it's considered to be among the most violent of revolutions that occur in world history. And so there were a lot of people, including my grandparents, who fled the violence, and they came to the United States, never intending to stay, but they just wanted to wait out the violence.
My grandparents, both of them fought in there, and they were actually enemies. And then my mom and dad got together, kind of brought together this two fighting factions. There's 1 million people killed and 1 million refugees when Mexico only had 15 million people. That's about the size of Guatemala right now. So it was very impactful. There's a lot of suffering, a lot of death.
It wasn't as heavily populated or urban, until maybe post the Mexican Revolution.
Then it started to go bigger, 30s and 40s, more coming over. But those were the first barrios.
Once the border patrol gets established, it becomes a little bit more policed, right? So it becomes more difficult. So Mexicans have to make a choice. If I cross over and work here, I might not be able to come back, right? So you actually see the development of Mexican-American communities in places like San Antonio and Tucson, in Los Angeles.
So today in the 21st century, we're largely color conscious when we think about race, right? And so when we invoke the terms of race, we think it has everything to do with skin color, right? It has a lot to do with prejudices that already exist about your place of origin, about your accent, about just all these ideas about what it meant to be Irish or to be meant to be Jewish or Italian, or, I mean, the list goes on and on. They're all thrown together in these segregated neighborhoods. That's what makes things really interesting when you start studying the social dynamics, is you have white working class kids living right next to Mexican Americans and African Americans as well, because that kind of ghettoization is where all the racialized individuals went. And it was more than just color.
We have to understand and accept that it's not like today, whereas today if we see Irish people, we see Italian people, we think of them all as white. This was not the case back in the day. Italians and Irish, Jews, Russians, they also had their little share of discrimination because they were non-Anglo.
They were forced to live in these areas. They had nothing to do. They couldn't go to the parks. They couldn't go to the movies. They weren't allowed to. Mexicans weren't allowed to go to those places, so they had nothing to do but hang out on the corner.
Gangs is a later phenomenon, but what happened is these young people would gather, and sometimes they would play and they would have clubs.
Whenever you get groups of people, they tend to form these little cliques. It could be a varsity football team that likes to go out and beat up another football team,
With my neighborhood, it was a football team. And then after that, there's another football team. So one football team starts fighting another, right? And that becomes a fight. And after that, it becomes where, hey, those guys are from here, we're from here, and they become a gang.